Welcome to Under the Dome. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has said COVID-19 measures must be balanced so they minimally impact charter rights and freedoms.
In so much of the debate, where have we forgotten about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Since when should governments start with an impairment of fundamental charter-protected rights and freedoms rather than engage in such an impairment as a last and final resort?
As cases continued to rise in November, the Alberta government introduced several new measures. Indoor gatherings are now formally banned, backed by a $1,000 fine. Outdoor gatherings have a strict 10-person limit. Businesses such as retail and restaurants now have a capacity limit of 25%, and kids in grades 7 to 12 will be learning online for the next several weeks. Kenney was criticized for not introducing stricter new measures and for using the charter to defend his reluctance to do so. Lawyers say that infringements are allowed under the charter so long as there is a clear and justifiable goal. Meanwhile, the opposition NDP criticized Kenney for not condemning anti-mask protesters.
At the same time, hundreds of people gathered this weekend without masks in complete violation of the Premier's own health orders. These marches are super spreader events that increase community risk, trigger more cases, cause severe pressure on the healthcare system, and ultimately lead to more deaths. Premier, will you condemn these marches and the Albertans who so irresponsibly organized them?
Kenney, for his part, said that protesters shouldn't gather while there are limits in place, but defended their right to protest.
Obviously, when it comes to the constitutionally protected right to protest, that is, and the enforcement of these measures, that's a matter for the police to determine, not for politicians to interfere in. But we would ask people not to engage in large-scale protests, and if they do so, to please wear masks.
My guests today are Jen Gerson. She's a columnist and co-founder of The Line. Jen, thanks very much for coming on. And Avnish Nanda, he's a lawyer with Nanda and Company, specializing in constitutional law in Alberta and BC. Avnish, thanks for coming on as well. So I want to get to you first, Avnish. Premier Jason Kenney, in some of his talking around COVID-19 measures, has said the government has a duty to infringe on rights as minimally as possible. Now, is that true? And what does the Constitution say about that?
Well, Dave, it's somewhat true in the sense that, the rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms are not absolute. They are subject to such reasonable limits prescribed by law that are demonstrated to be justified in a free and democratic society. That means that in certain instances, when there's an overarching public interest or good being pursued by the state, they can infringe on the rights and liberties protected in the Charter. Under that framework, which is the Section 1 framework, there's a requirement that in order to pursue and obtain that stated public interest, the government should undertake action that is as minimally as impairing on other rights and liberties and interests as necessary to obtain that objective. But it's important to understand that the issue here appears to be that perhaps the means taken by the government to obtain that objective are not effective enough to even obtain that objective. So I don't think we're even in a discussion that this is going beyond what is necessary to obtain an objective. But more than that, I think it's important to also recognize that courts give governments a latitude or a scope of discretion. So it doesn't have to be the most minimally impairing thing. It can be within the range of what's acceptable to obtain a particular government objective.
Jen, what do you think about Premier Kenney talking about rights in this way related to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I agree with Avnish 99% there. I mean, the way that he's using language here is very misleading because he's trying to create the illusion that his actions are limited by some kind of charter restrictions. And I mean, Avnish would be able to speak to this better than I could, but I mean, I believe that the precedent, especially on public health restrictions, is extensively in favor of government interference. I don't think that there is a reasonable argument to be said that requiring masks or shutting down businesses would fail to meet the Oakes test, would fail to meet a restriction imposed that would be reasonable in a democratic society. So, his relying on that kind of language and that kind of rhetoric is misleading. That said, I do think that governments have a certain degree of a moral duty not to be unnecessarily or overly punitive, and to try and go for consensus before restriction, if that makes sense, to try and find the buy-in of the community in order to impose widespread changes to behavior before they go straight to a highly restrictive and punitive approach. I think that that's just a moral and ideological duty, not necessarily a legal one. And I think that there are also questions about social license buy-in. I mean, the CBC recently had a really amazing scoop where they released something like 20 conversations that had happened between civil service and government about how to impose restrictions and how to balance economic interests and personal rights objectives. And Dina Hinshaw herself had a fascinating quote about that, where she said, look, I think we're starting to lose social license on some of this stuff. Calgary's only got something like 2,000 police officers and a couple hundred more bylaw officers. Mm-hmm. And we're a city of 1 million people. So, and I think Edmonton is about the same. So you can't force 1 million people into their homes. You can't necessarily, we just don't have the enforcement capacity to be incredibly restrictive, or to take, for example, a Sydney or a Melbourne approach. You need the people as a whole to buy into these restrictions, and you need self-enforcement to be your guiding light on some of this stuff, because, to be blunt, we just don't have the capacity to have guns in the streets and people getting nailed into their homes, right? So, I think that there genuinely is a balance there, and I think there's also a genuine argument to be made about whether or not Kenney is riding that balance appropriately.
Yeah, Avnish, what do you make of the idea of moral obligation on the part of government and the idea of getting social license to implement some of these policies?
I think that's the bedrock of any public health approach. Anyone who works in this area will say that. But I would just say that failure to act to address things and elongating the pandemic may lead to the same results, or when the government decides that, well, now we have to have a shutdown, now we have to have a curfew, that there's less trust in both the government, but also Dr. Dina Hinshaw in bringing forth measures that will actually achieve what they claim to be, particularly if this government is putting so much emphasis on the current restrictions with the hope that it'll reduce the current rate.
Why do you suppose, looking at this politically, Jason Kenney has talked in the past about infringing on rights when it comes to protesters? There was the whole idea that they wanted to pass a law that made it illegal for people to block railways. He seemed fine with that infringement on freedoms, but he's hesitant on the idea of the freedoms around some of these provisions with regard to the pandemic.
Well, part of that is just straightforward political hypocrisy. The protests around rail links and infrastructure. I don't think that you could make a reasonable case that they shouldn't have been brought down legally, but of course, passing laws. I mean, weren't there already existing laws, more or less, prohibiting protesters and people from shutting down major rail links? I think that what was also hypocritical about that particular legislation that Kenney brought in is that it was unnecessary. But Avnish could probably correct me on that. But no, I mean, some of it is just it is a sort of ideological hypocrisy. But to say that the impact of shutting down a rail line is the same as the impact of shutting down, for example, all small businesses, I'm not sure that those two arguments are quite in the same bucket, or if those are the same apples to apples comparison. But I'm open to debate on that front.
Now, Avnish, Jen mentioned the idea that there's a balance to be played here. The idea that there's minimal infringement when you're asking someone to put on a mask, but if you're looking at shutting down the economy, it's a much bigger deal. At what point do infringing on people's liberties become acceptable and unacceptable under the charter? Is there an area where the government could go too far?
Yeah, and it's important to note that like there's no right to economic liberty. Economic rights aren't protected under the charter. There are other aspects where businesses or corporations can kind of advance a charter right or protection, which is like freedom of expression, but not with liberty. But there are many reasons. But where a government can impose a restriction in the COVID context, and it would be deemed to be perhaps unconstitutional. But the real key is that Jen mentioned is that you need to have your evidence, and you need to have an objective that's clear, and it needs to be the measures you're using need to be related to that objective, but also be proportionate to what you need to achieve that objective. And that's where that evidentiary burden really comes to play. But just mentioning Jason Kenney, the thing with Jason Kenney is that he has been a gift for constitutional lawyers across Canada. There have been a number of cases, including in Alberta, where Jason Kenney has imposed some sort of law or restriction, and because of that, a variety of lawsuits have been commenced, and our understanding of the charter has expanded because the restriction taken by Jason Kenney has been just so outlandish. So we owe a lot of, like as constitutional lawyers, a lot of credit to Jason Kenney for, his history of doing things that really expand our notion of what rights protections are. And even in the COVID context, he has done some stuff where I think I'm certain that courts in Alberta in coming months will make determinations that will further expand our understanding of charter protections when it comes to opioid use or vulnerable youth and a number of other things. And this is a premier who has a track record of kind of claiming to be in defense of charter rights, but the evidence is contrary.
Mitch, could you provide us some specific examples? I'm really curious about that point.
Sure. Refugee care. When Jason Kenney was the immigration minister, he denied refugee claimants access to health care. There was a lawsuit that was filed claiming a number of things. That lawsuit was one of the first times the first time that a Canadian court has found that a government conduct was cruel and unusual, but not in the criminal context, but in the civil law context, which had never been determined ever before. And I'm involved in at least 2 pieces of litigation in Alberta against this government, where I'm making the same argument based on that precedent decision that a court made on a previous Jason Kenney law.
There's another point that you made that I'm really curious to follow up on, and that is, you correctly noted that the charter doesn't guarantee economic laws. So is this maybe not so much a charter argument, so much as a damages fear? Like if the government shuts down the economy and thousands of businesses go out of business or have to declare bankruptcy, could those businesses then sue the government for an inappropriate action that costs them their financial livelihoods?
There's a potential, there's a constitutional argument and there's a civil law non-constitutional arguments. And what I'm interested to see is at some point, I think governments may be sued for, actual infections and people dying. There may be measures in the public health context or a pandemic context or emergency health context where there's no liability, but there are so many other legal measures to hold governments accountable for failing to do something or overreaching, and it's just not with the Constitution.
Now, speaking as a lawyer, you talk about areas where Jason Kenney has potentially been on the wrong side of the law. When it comes to some of the measures that have been implemented, the idea that they can fine people for having gatherings at their home, do you think he's on a solid legal footing as far as that goes?
I do think so. I think a lot of those administrative penalties, are reasonable, proportionate. I don't think there is a constitutional ground to challenge them because they're for a specific purpose, for a short duration of time with the desired end. So I don't think there's any issue there. The thing that I think we all have to recognize is that Jason Kenney can't put in place criminal law powers. He can't declare things to be a crime or not because that's federal government jurisdiction. But these administrative penalties are well within his realm.
Now, the idea of gatherings, one of the subjects that a lot of Kenney's critics on the right have taken exception to. There were down in your area, Jen, in Calgary, there were protests over the gathering limits and the idea of having to wear masks. What do we make of the movement against Kenney in the realm of you're taking our freedoms away?
For me, this goes back to the first point that I made, and that was the decay of social license. And Avnish is an expert in the legal realm, and I would defer to him in all things. I'm pretty good at communications, and I think most governments, including Jason Kenney's, has been frankly disastrous on communications when it comes to COVID right from the beginning. And I think that is one of the first ways that you start to see breakdown of social license, breakdown of trust, and breakdown of social cohesion. I think that a lot of what we're seeing with the anti-maskers is simply a reflection of that.
Avnish, your thoughts on those protests over the weekend?
Yeah, I also think there's a cultural context in Alberta that's unique. I think there is a strong kind of libertarian sentiment in this, or strain in this province. I'm a lawyer, I'm an Albertan, but I'm also a member of a cultural community that, Jason Kenney in the past week has really called out for, having a responsibility to bring down numbers. And I just can't help but compare this government's response to kind of anti-maskers congregating in large numbers in downtown Calgary versus people in Northeast Calgary or Southeast Edmonton who, work in these frontline essential worker jobs and being chastised for not doing enough to bring down numbers when, they have to work outside. They're working in difficult places and places where often, you're more likely than not going to get an infection.
And lastly, I just want to touch on something. I've noticed that there's fairly heated discourse on social media, and I, take it for what it's worth. But you have people who, in the spring, would have been defending those who were attending these big Black Lives Matter protests, saying that they had every right to protest. And now a lot of those same people who may have been defending those rallies are criticizing the people who are attending these anti-mask and anti-gathering limits rallies. And it's vice versa. The people who attended these rallies over the weekend might be the same people who were complaining about these Black Lives Matter protests in the spring, saying, well, how come we all have to stay in our homes, but they can hold this big rally at the legislature for Black Lives Matter? Is there any...
Everyone's
sorry, go ahead, Jen.
Everyone's a political hypocrite. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, everyone's guilty of this particular political sin.
I think that people should be, if they want to protest in large numbers, go and protest in large numbers. But there are consequences, and that particular comment that I made was kind of twofold. One, in the context of this government not really being willing to kind of criticize those that they think that they rely upon, but also I think there's a false equivocation or this notion that every political issue that rallies people are equal. I don't think that, and that's my bias, right? In this particular case, it's my bias.
But Avnish, that's not the argument at all. I don't think you and I would be on the same page in terms of our opinions about anti-maskers. I've been strong about masks, for months and months and months now. And I think that a lot of these people who are protesting against mandatory mask laws are being ridiculous. But that being said, I'm also deeply sympathetic to Black Lives Matter, and I completely agree with you that there's a fundamental hypocrisy with Jason Kenney criticizing the Southeast Asian community, but not being willing to criticize anti-maskers. So we're on board completely on all of that stuff. But the hypocrisy of pointing out these two respective gatherings is to note that the risk of spreading COVID is the same in a Black Lives Matter protest as it is in an anti-masker protest. So even if I don't regard these two movements as morally comparable, the risk is identical because they're effectively engaging in the same behaviors. So that I think is fair to point out. I think it is fair to point out that there's some hypocrisy there.
On both points. So what Matt Wolf was trying to, I think, do was create some sort of I think, and this is my view, and Jen, we may disagree, but context matters. Like, I think these both protests mean something, but they happen at different times too, right? We're not in a situation now like we did we're in the summer where those numbers, like there wasn't even the same realm in terms of what we're talking about in terms of COVID infections. And also, I have this view towards this government about the language it uses when it comes to public health, where this tweet is not meant to get people on the same page when it comes to addressing this pandemic. It's meant to vilify, it's meant to polarize, and it's meant to drive up a certain portion of the electorate. So I just don't take Matt Wolf's tweets, the Premier's tweets, at face value of actually adding to the discourse and the goals that we have or ought to have as a province of kind of bringing down COVID infection rates. But so yeah, I think there's a different context, but I appreciate Jen's view that we need to be focused on the risks here. And if the risks are one rally high and another rally at high, who cares about what the morality is behind it? We need to address it.
Yeah, well, and also I would kind of agree with you on that point, but I would further it and I would say I've been kind of disappointed with how all of our political leaders have allowed over the last couple of months COVID to essentially become partisan. And as a result, you now have like competing groups engaging in high risk behaviors because they're associating those particular behaviors or those particular movements with their respective political tribes. Like we've all fundamentally failed to get on board as a collective society to really just address the panic and the crisis at hand. And again, for me, it goes back to those basic issues of social cohesion and developing a sense of collective trust around our leaders and around our movements going forward. There's just been a profound failure from the top on down to get everybody on the same page. And I hear you, and I would agree with you that yes, I think that Matt Wolf and Jason Kenney are engaging in partisan politics behavior on the back of this pandemic, and that is to be condemned. They're the guys in charge, so they're the guys who eat that. But it's not just them. It's like all of our political leaders can't help themselves anymore. And I think that's really shameful. And we're going to have to deal with the consequences of that as a society in the next couple of months.
And on that happy note, we'll leave it there. Jen Gerson, Avnish Nanda, thanks very much for your time. That's it for Under the Dome this week. You can find all our past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome. But don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.